Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You know when a river crests its banks and a massive flood just wipes out an entire valley, the immediate aftermath is, well, it's just utter devastation.
Right, total erasure of what was there before.
Yeah, exactly. The old growth, the established roots, the whole architecture of that ecosystem is scoured away. But, nature abhors a vacuum. From that bare earth, new growth inevitably emerges. And occasionally the system that replaces the old one grows much deeper roots and creates this massive interconnected canopy that's designed specifically to withstand the next deluge.
And the floodwaters, at least in the context of our sources for this deep dive today, were the military campaigns of the Delhi Sultanate. They were pouring into southern India in the early 14th century. So that canopy that grew in the aftermath covering the peninsula, that was the Vijayanagara Empire.
Right. And our mission today is to unpack the mechanics, the extensive history, and the legacy of that exact empire. We're looking at a polity that arose from, basically a geopolitical graveyard spanning roughly from 1336 to 1646.
Which is a very central piece of our Indian history series.
It is. We're going to explore how a state forged in an absolute power vacuum managed to integrate foreign military tactics, engineer massive water networks in a pretty harsh semi-arid climate, and just dictate global trade right from its capital.
And to map this out for you, we are synthesizing a very specific stack of source materials. We're looking closely at contemporary stone inscriptions and copper plate grants.
Which give us the hard data, right?
Exactly. The hard data on land ownership, taxation, legal disputes. Then we're also analyzing regional literary epics to understand their cultural and ideological framework. And we're leaning heavily on detailed travelogues from Persian, Italian, and Portuguese merchants.
These are people who actually walked the streets of the capital.
Yeah, they inspected the markets, observed the military mobilizations, and documented the daily life of this booming metropolis.
Okay, so let's start with the flood. Because to understand Vijayanagara, you really have to understand the void it filled. We're in the early 14th century, and the southern peninsula's political order had been completely, systematically dismantled.
Right, because prior to the 1300s, the Deccan Plateau and the territories further south, they were anchored by several formidable Hindu states. You had the Yadava Empire operating out of Devagiri in the north. To their east, the Kakatiya dynasty ruled from Warangal.
And further south, you had the Hoysalas.
Yes, the Hoysala centered in Dwarasamudra, and then the Pandyas controlling the deep south from Madurai. And, these were highly prosperous kingdoms. They were sustained by robust agricultural networks and Indian Ocean trade. But that stability ruptured when the Delhi Sultanate, specifically under the Khalji dynasty and their general Malik Kafur, began military incursions deep into the south around 1309 and 1311.
And the sources clarify that these initial incursions, they weren't wars of occupation, were they?
No, not at all. They were wealth-extracting raids. They were highly punitive. Malik Kafur's campaigns were designed to strip the accumulated wealth of the southern capitals. He extracted vast quantities of gold, war elephants, jewels, and basically forced the southern kings into subservient tributary relationships.
Just extracting whatever they could carry.
Yeah, but the geopolitical reality shifted drastically from mere extraction to total annexation under the subsequent Tughlaq dynasty, specifically under Muhammad bin Tughlaq in the 1320s.
Right, because Tughlaq didn't just want the gold, he wanted the territory.
He sought direct, centralized control. By 1323, the Kakatiya capital of Warangal was besieged and completely dismantled. The Hoysala power base was shattered, which culminated in the death of their king, Veerabalala III. He was killed fighting the newly established, localized Madurai Sultanate around 1343.
So even the smaller kingdoms were hit.
Oh, absolutely. The fiercely independent frontier kingdoms like Kampeli were just entirely wiped off the map.
So you really need to picture a total collapse of the regional order here. The old guard is gone, the ancient capitals are sacked, the administrative networks are broken, and this massive power vacuum stretches across the southern peninsula. And into this void step two brothers, Harihara I and Bukharaya I.
The founders of what becomes the Sangama dynasty.
Exactly. But looking at the historical record, their exact origins are a matter of intense debate in the sources.
Yeah, they really are. The primary sources present two distinct theories regarding where Harihara and Bukha actually came from. The first theory, which is heavily supported by modern epigraphic research, so the study of physical inscriptions, suggests the brothers were Kannadiga commanders who had formerly served the Hoysala Empire.
Okay, so they were already in the military hierarchy.
Right. The Hoysalas had stationed commanders in their northern territories, specifically near the Tungapadra River, to guard against the northern invasions. According to this model, when the central Hoysala state crumbled, these localized military men utilized their existing authority and their existing troops to consolidate power. They essentially formed a successor state out of the wreckage.
I mean, that makes logical sense. They were military men already holding a defensive line, and they simply refused to fall back. But the second theory paints a very, very different picture.
It does. The second theory is drawn from later literary traditions and court chronicles. It posits that the brothers were actually Telugu treasury officers who had served the Kakatiya king, Prataparudra II, in Warangal.
Treasury officers.
Yeah, accountants, essentially. The narrative claims that when Warangal fell in 1323, the brothers fled south to Kampili. When Kampili also fell, they were supposedly captured by Tughlaq's forces, taken all the way to Delhi, forcibly converted to Islam, and then dispatched back to the south as governors to quell local rebellions.
Wait. Sorry, but if they were treasury officers, how do they suddenly pivot to forging a military empire? And furthermore, how does this highly dramatic narrative of capture, conversion, and reconversion actually hold up against the empirical evidence?
Well, to answer the first part, if you look at the mechanics of medieval administration, the line between managing a treasury and commanding an army was basically non-existent.
Really?
Yeah, a treasury official's primary job was often the logistics of warfare, assessing agricultural yields, securing supply lines, paying mercenaries. Surviving the collapse of an entire regional order demanded absolute adaptability. Scribes and accountants would necessarily pick up the sword to forge defensive coalitions, if only to protect their own lives and local interests.
Okay, so the skill set's transferred.
Exactly. But as for the capture and reconversion narrative, it lacks strong empirical backing from contemporary inscriptions.
Because the sources mention that the earliest inscriptions we have from the 1330s show Harihar I acting straightforwardly as a Hindu ruler.
Right.
He's making land grants, establishing administrative outposts, and there's no mention of a stint as a Muslim governor for Delhi.
None at all. The copper plate grants and stone inscriptions from their early reign reflect an unbroken continuity of Hindu administrative practices. It's highly probable that the founders were localized elites, whether originally Hoysala commanders or displaced Kakatiya officers, who just recognized the existential threat of the Sultanate expansions.
They saw what was coming.
They did, and they pragmatically united the fragmented local chieftains into a cohesive defensive bloc. The dramatic capture narrative was likely a later fabrication.
Which brings us to another major figure in the founding hagiography, the sage Vijayanagara. The traditional narrative frames him as the spiritual architect of the empire, like a man who literally pointed to a spot on the riverbank, told the brothers to build a capital there, and then coronated them.
Right. The role of Vijayanagara is a textbook study in how empires retrospectively build their own legitimacy. Vijayanagara was a genuine historical figure. He was a prominent scholar saint associated with the Sringeri monastic order and the author of significant philosophical texts.
So he was a real influential person.
He was, and later traditions heavily credit him with inspiring the brothers to forge a state specifically to defend Hindu Dharma. But when you examine the empirical inscriptions from the 1330s, the founders are shown acting out of cold strategic realism.
Not divine inspiration.
Right. They're negotiating military alliances, securing trade routes, fortifying geographic choke points.
They were building a state to survive, not a monastery.
Exactly. The extensive involvement of Vijayanagara appears to be a narrative constructed decades after the fact. By aligning the physical origins of the empire with a revered spiritual leader, the later rulers provided their martial conquests with a divine mandate.
Which provides necessary ideological cohesion for a very diverse population.
Yes, but the initial physical establishment of the state was an act of raw geopolitical survival.
And you see that survival reflected in the very name they chose. The Sanskrit compound Vijayanagara, City of Victory.
It was a deliberate ideological statement. This wasn't mere toponymy, it was a broadcast to the remaining Hindu populations of the south that a resilient center of gravity had been established.
A safe haven.
A very heavily fortified safe haven. The capital was strategically positioned on the rocky, highly defensible southern banks of the Tungabhadra River. The terrain itself is a chaotic jumble of massive granite boulders which acts as a natural fortress.
But it's vital to note that the very first fortification Harihar I built wasn't actually inland. It was at Barakuru in coastal Karnataka.
Right, which speaks to their strategic foresight, because you cannot survive a siege without supplies, and coastal access ensures you're plugged into the Indian Ocean trade networks right from the inception.
So we have the establishment of the state in 1336. Let's track how this fledgling defense pact evolved chronologically into an imperial powerhouse. The empire was ruled by 4 distinct dynasties over its 3-century lifespan: the Sangama, the Saluva, the Tuluva, and the Aravidu.
Let's look at the consolidation phase under the Sangama dynasty, specifically focusing on a ruler named Devaraya II. He ruled from 1424 to 1446.
Okay, so nearly a century after the founding.
Yes. And Devaraya II is a crucial figure because he recognized a fundamental systemic vulnerability in his military. In the ongoing generational border wars with the Bahmani Sultanate, which was the powerful Islamic state that had formed in the northern Deccan Vijayanagara, was frequently at a severe disadvantage in open-pitched battle.
Why was that?
The Bahmani forces possessed superior cavalry and highly skilled mounted archers.
Right, because the Bahmani Sultanate had direct access to the overland trade routes bringing in Persian and Arabian horses, and they had a military tradition deeply rooted in Central Asian cavalry tactics. If I'm looking at this, it's sort of like a modern corporation, realizing their rival has a vastly superior engineering department. You don't just keep trying to train your current staff using outdated manuals. You go out and you poach the rival's engineers. You bring their exact expertise in-house.
That mechanism of knowledge transfer is exactly what happened here. Devaraya II displayed immense military pragmatism. Instead of maintaining a rigid isolationist stance based on religious differences, he actively recruited thousands of Turkish and Muslim cavalrymen directly into the Vijayanagara army.
He just hired them.
He did. He recognized that to defeat his adversaries, he had to integrate their core tactical advantages.
And the sources say he didn't just hire them as disposable mercenaries, right? He integrated them deeply into the state apparatus to ensure their loyalty.
He granted them lands, known as jagirs, to sustain their families and provide a stable income. He respected and accommodated their religious practices, going so far as to fund the construction of mosques for them within the capital city itself.
That is a massive level of accommodation for the time.
It is. He famously placed a copy of the Quran before his throne so that his Muslim commanders could offer their respects to the king without compromising their own religious obligations.
Wow, I mean, that is a highly complex diplomatic maneuver.
It fundamentally transformed the Vijayanagara military. It upgraded their mobility, their shock tactics, their long-range striking capability. This allowed Devaraya II to push back effectively against the Bahmani Sultanate and even project naval power overseas. He extracted tribute from territories as far away as Pegu in modern Myanmar.
So that pragmatism kept the empire expanding. But dynasties rarely maintain that level of competence indefinitely. Following Devaraya II, the later Sangama rulers were weak and indecisive, which led to severe internal fragmentation.
Yeah, the decline was significant.
By 1485, the empire was on the verge of collapsing from within. And this initiates the Saluva interregnum.
The central authority had deteriorated to the point where provincial governors were basically acting independently. They were keeping tax revenues for themselves, and external enemies like the Gajapati Kingdom of Odisha were actively seizing Vijayanagara territory along the eastern Coromandel coast. The whole system was failing.
So someone has to step in.
Right. In 1485, a powerful military commander named Saluva Narasimha executed a coup. He deposed the final, ineffective Sangama ruler.
So it's essentially a military coup dressed up as a rescue mission.
And a very necessary one, because the Gajapati kingdom was already chewing up the eastern coastline. Saluva Narasimha's reign was entirely dedicated to reclamation. He fought brutal, protracted campaigns to recapture key eastern fortresses like Udayagiri and Kondavidu from the Gajapatis.
So he's not expanding, he's just stopping the bleeding.
Exactly. He didn't dramatically expand the borders of the empire, but he stabilized the fractured frontiers and prevented a total systemic collapse. His dynasty was short-lived, serving as a bridge to the third lineage, the Tuluva dynasty, which was initiated by Veera Narasimha in 1505.
And the Tuluva dynasty brings us to the absolute zenith of the Vijayanagara Empire. This era is defined almost entirely by one ruler, Krishnadevaraya, who reigned from 1509 to 1529.
A truly pivotal figure.
The sources describe a massive shift in military doctrine under his command. They moved from a defensive posture, just trying to hold the line or reclaim lost forts, to highly aggressive, expansionist offensive warfare.
Krishnadevaraya possessed an exceptional grasp of both grand strategy and the granular logistics required to actually execute it. He recognized that the best defense against the northern sultanates and the eastern Gajapatis was to systematically dismantle their forward operating bases. We see the mechanics of this strategy perfectly in the siege of Udayagiri in 1513.
Udayagiri was a massive Gajapati stronghold, and the sources say the siege took a full year.
A full year, which requires immense logistical support to keep an army fed and relatively disease-free in a stationary camp for that long.
Right. The supply chains for that must have been incredibly complex.
Oh, absolutely. And Udayagiri was situated on a steep, isolated rocky hill, which made traditional infantry assaults nearly impossible. The terrain dictated the tactics. Krishnadevaraya mobilized a massive infantry force, but he supported them with heavy artillery and war elephants.
Wait, how do you use elephants on a steep rocky hill?
Well, they physically had to cut new paths and ramps through the solid rock to drag their heavy cannons into firing positions.
That is a staggering engineering feat.
It was an engineering project as much as a military operation. After finally starving out and breaching Udayagiri, he pushed relentlessly further north, systematically dismantling the Gajapati defenses along the eastern coast until they sued for peace.
But his most significant victory, the one that cemented his legacy, came a few years later in 1520, the Battle of Raichur.
Yes, the Battle of Raichur is one of the defining conflicts of the 16th century in India. It was fought against the forces of the Bijapur Sultanate for absolute control of the Raichur Doab.
And a doab is the highly fertile tract of land lying between two converging rivers, right?
Exactly. In this case, the Krishna River to the north and the Tungabhadra River to the south. In an arid landscape, control of the doab meant control of immense agricultural surplus cotton fields, rice paddies, and crucially, highly lucrative diamond mines.
The sources emphasize that Vijayanagara utilized superior cavalry tactics and, very specifically, advanced artillery supplied by Portuguese merchants to secure this victory. They completely routed the Bijapur forces, captured the Sultan's camp, and secured the doab.
The integration of Portuguese firearms and specialized artillerymen demonstrates the ongoing technological adaptation of the Vijayanagara military. They were actively sourcing the best available technology on the global market to maintain localized dominance.
Which brings us to a massive logistical question. We're looking at an empire that can field armies of hundreds of thousands of men, conduct year-long sieges involving rock-cutting engineering, and administer vast tracts of newly conquered territory. How do you fund, feed, and control an army of that size in the 16th century?
The answer lies in their specific administrative framework, a structure known as the Nayankara system or the Amara Nayaka system.
Okay, let's break that down.
To understand how this functioned, you first have to understand the conceptual position of the king. The Vijayanagara monarch was an absolute sovereign. He held supreme executive, judicial, and legislative power. But his authority wasn't merely secular. He was viewed as the earthly representative and executor for the patron deity Virupaksha.
So a divine right to rule that provides absolute ideological authority.
An ideological authority that underpinned a very specific economic reality. The king theoretically owned all the land in the empire, every acre of arable land, every mine, every port.
But he couldn't govern all of it directly.
Right. He was assisted by a central council led by the Mahapradhana, or chief minister. But the genius and the ultimate vulnerability of the Vijayanagara administration was how it handled the provinces. The king granted tracts of land, known as Amaram, to military commanders called Nayakas.
Wait, hold on. The king gives land to lords in exchange for military service. How does this differ from standard European feudalism, where a king gives a fief to a duke or an earl?
It is a crucial structural distinction. In European feudalism, those fiefs were largely hereditary. The land belonged to the noble family, passing from father to son across generations. This allowed those families to build deeply entrenched multi-generational power bases, form local alliances, and often rival the power of the king himself.
So a duke could raise an army against the king using the wealth of the land the king's ancestor gave his ancestor.
Exactly. But the Nyankara system was explicitly and legally non-hereditary. The Amaram was a service tenure. The land remained the property of the king, and the Nayaka was merely a royal administrator assigned to extract its revenue.
So the king could essentially reassign a Nayaka to a completely different province if they started getting too comfortable or building too much local influence.
Precisely. The king could, and frequently did, transfer Nayakas from one end of the empire to the other to prevent them from establishing deep, localized roots. It was a highly centralized system masquerading as a decentralized one.
Interesting.
The Nayakas were responsible for local law enforcement, managing agricultural infrastructure like irrigation tanks, and collecting the royal taxes.
And in exchange for this massive revenue stream, what were the mechanics of their obligation to the king?
They owed a strictly proportional military force. Depending on the assessed agricultural and commercial revenue of their specific Amaram lands, a Nayaka was required to maintain a precise number of foot soldiers, cavalrymen, and war elephants, constantly trained and ready for the king's use at a moment's notice.
So it's tied directly to the land's output.
Yes. The sources indicate a typical administrative ratio was one fully equipped warrior maintained for every 25 soldiers' worth of village revenue. Furthermore, after paying for the upkeep of this localized army, they had to remit a fixed, substantial portion of their collected tax directly to the central treasury in the capital.
It's a brilliant mechanism for state building, but it sounds like a double-edged sword.
It absolutely was.
On one hand, this system allowed the empire to rapidly mobilize a massive army without the logistical nightmare of running a centralized draft. Foreign travelers like the Portuguese merchant Fernão Nunes estimated the total available force at over 600,000 infantry and 24,000 cavalry.
And some Persian accounts put the mobilized numbers near 1 million during peak conflicts.
And the central government didn't go bankrupt because the immense financial burden of feeding, housing, and outfitting these troops was decentralized to the local Nayakas.
The system generated massive, immediate martial capability without draining the central treasury. It allowed the king to focus on grand strategy, while the Nayakas handled the granular logistics of military upkeep.
However, the exact structure that provided this immediate strength contained the architectural flaws that would eventually tear the empire apart.
Right, because if the central authority ever weakened...
If a king could no longer enforce those transfers, you suddenly have hundreds of heavily armed, wealthy military governors with no incentive to obey the capital. We'll see how that plays out later. But while the central kings were strong, particularly under Krishna-devaraya, the Nyankar system was highly effective.
Very effective.
And what about everyday governance? If the Nayakas are focused on military upkeep and extracting revenue, who is handling the actual civic disputes? If two farmers argue over water rights, who decides?
Everyday jurisprudence was grounded in the Dharmashastras, which are the traditional Hindu legal and ethical texts. While the king was the ultimate appellate judge, the state did not micromanage local disputes.
They delegated it.
Yes. Everyday issues over land boundaries, irrigation rights, or inheritance were typically settled by local assemblies called Mahajanas. These were localized councils composed of village elders, guild representatives, and prominent landowners.
So the decentralized legal system operating beneath the military framework.
Correct. The Mahajanas would hear the disputes, apply customary law and the Dharmashastras, and render a verdict. Crucially, their decisions were often inscribed on stone walls in local temples or recorded on copper plates for absolute permanence.
Written in stone, literally.
Literally. It was a system that respected local customs and maintained social order without requiring constant intervention from the Nayakas or the king.
Okay, so we have a society supporting hundreds of thousands of soldiers, local administrators, and massive engineering projects. That requires staggering amounts of wealth. Let's shift our focus to the economic engine that sustained the Vijayanagara state, because the Deccan Plateau is not a lush, easy environment.
Far from it. The climate of the Deccan is harsh. It is semi-arid, characterized by rocky soil and highly prone to severe seasonal droughts. To generate the vast agricultural surplus necessary to fund a million-man military state, the Vijayanagara rulers had to intervene heavily in hydrology.
They had to control the water.
Yes, agriculture was the absolute backbone of the economy, but it required continuous, massive state-sponsored engineering.
The sources detail an intricate empire-wide system of tanks, canals, and aqueducts. And when the sources use the word tanks, we need to be clear about the scale here. We're not talking about a village pond.
We are talking about massive artificial reservoirs, sometimes covering dozens of square miles. The engineering mechanism involved identifying natural valleys or depressions and constructing massive earthen and stone dams across them to capture and hold the violent, concentrated runoff from the seasonal monsoons.
Just trapping the monsoon rains.
Exactly. The emperors initiated massive public works projects to tap the Tungabhadra River itself, constructing weirs to raise the water level and channeling it miles inland through gravity-fed canals to irrigate water-intensive crops like rice, sugarcane, and cotton.
The Kamalapuram tank near Hampi is a prime example of this. It's a massive body of water that completely altered the local microclimate and allowed for continuous cultivation.
And the state's taxation system was meticulously calibrated based on this infrastructure. The Revenue Department categorized land based on its soil quality and its access to state-sponsored water.
So they taxed based on the yield potential.
Right. Generally, the land tax was set at roughly 1/6 of the gross produce. However, wet lands fields that benefited directly from the state's irrigation canals were taxed at a significantly higher rate than dry, rain-fed lands that only grew hardy crops like millet.
Which is entirely logical.
Yes.
If the state provides the hydraulic infrastructure that allows you to grow high-value cash crops and triple your yield, the state takes a larger cut of that generated wealth.
It was a very pragmatic system.
But agriculture, while foundational, was only the internal engine. Vijayanagara was also a massive node in global trade.
Their military expansion toward the coasts gave them direct control of critical deepwater ports on both the Malabar coast in the west and the Coromandel coast in the east. This allowed them to control the export of high-value commodities.
Like pepper.
Yes, they exported vast quantities of black pepper, which was worth nearly its weight in gold in European markets. And finely woven cotton textiles that were demanded across Southeast Asia, and diamonds extracted from the mines in the Deccan.
But the most critical trade wasn't what they were sending out into the world. It was what they desperately needed to bring in. War horses.
This is a vital geopolitical constraint. The semi-arid climate, the specific mineral content of the water, and the severe lack of suitable, nutrient-rich pasture land in southern India meant it was biologically and logistically impossible to breed high-quality cavalry horses locally.
The environment just wouldn't allow it.
The local breeds were small and unsuited for heavy shock combat. Yet, heavy cavalry was the absolute prerequisite for fighting the northern sultanates on equal terms. Therefore, the very survival of the Vijayanagara state depended on importing thousands of high-quality horses annually from Arabia and Persia.
The logistics of that are mind-boggling. Moving thousands of horses across the Arabian Sea in wooden ships, keeping them alive and healthy during a multi-week voyage, and then transporting them inland.
It was an immense undertaking.
And this entire supply chain is suddenly disrupted when Vasco da Gama arrives in 1498. The geopolitical landscape of the Indian Ocean changes forever.
The Portuguese arrival was a massive disruption. They possessed superior naval artillery and rapidly seized control of key maritime choke points, most notably capturing the port city of Goa in 1510.
Which chokes off the horse supply.
By doing so, the Portuguese effectively monopolized the maritime horse trade, wresting control from the established networks of Arab and Persian merchants. Vijayanagara found itself in a precarious position. They absolutely could not afford to be cut off from their primary military supply line.
So how did they handle this new monopoly? Did they try to dislodge the Portuguese militarily?
They chose diplomacy and immense wealth. Krishnadevara recognized the reality of Portuguese naval dominance. In 1514, he signed a highly strategic treaty with the Portuguese authorities.
He essentially buys them out. He agrees to pay whatever premium they demand to secure the supply line.
A staggering premium. He secured the exclusive right to purchase all the Arabian and Persian horses brought by the Portuguese to Goa, specifically cutting off the supply to his northern rivals, the Sultanates.
Ensuring Vijayanagara had the cavalry advantage.
Exactly. The sources, including Portuguese records, suggest the financial transactions were immense, sometimes reaching the equivalent of 20,000 pounds sterling per deal, paid entirely in physical gold.
That is a massive transfer of wealth.
It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. The Portuguese gained highly lucrative access to the deep inland markets for their imported spices, copper, and European textiles, and Vijayanagara maintained its critical military edge.
But to facilitate this volume of international trade, you can't rely on barter. You need a deeply monetized economy and a stable currency.
Very true.
The empire minted gold coins known as varajas. The European traders often called them pagodas because the coins frequently featured intricate images of Hindu temple towers on one side. They also minted highly standardized fractional copper coins called jitals for everyday, low-value market transactions.
The standardization of this currency across the empire, particularly under the centralizing efforts of Krishnadevara, allowed for deep monetization. It meant that taxes, especially from the wealthy commercial guilds and the Nayakas, could be collected in physical cash rather than just grain.
Because cash is infinitely easier to transport, store, and utilize for state expenditures.
Like buying thousands of horses or paying mercenaries.
I want to try to picture what this density of wealth actually looked like on the ground. We have accounts from several foreign travelers who were genuinely stunned by the scale of the capital. Niccolo de Conti, an Italian merchant who visited around 1420, noted that the capital was protected by massive walls spanning roughly 60 miles in circumference.
Abdur-Razzaq, an envoy from the Timurid Empire in Persia who arrived in 1443, left a highly vivid account of the commercial districts. He described a city where the jewelers sold pearls, rubies, and diamonds openly in the streets without fear of theft, indicating a highly effective internal security apparatus.
What stands out to you when you read Razzaq's account?
The sheer volume of non-essential luxury goods. Razzaq wrote extensively about the roses. He noted that roses were sold in the markets everywhere, stating that the people could not live without them, treating them as a daily staple alongside food.
Roses as a daily staple.
Yes, it paints a picture of an urban society that had moved far beyond mere survival and was actively indulging in refined aromatic luxuries. And then we had the meticulously detailed accounts of Domingo Paes, a Portuguese traveler who resided in the capital during Krishnadevaraya's reign in the 1520s.
Paes' account feels almost like an architectural survey. He describes the defensive layout. 7 concentric rings of fortifications, enclosing not just the urban core, but vast tracts of agricultural land to ensure the city could not be easily starved out during a siege.
He details sophisticated stone aqueducts bringing fresh water directly into the homes of the nobility.
And he details the economic regulation. He described wide avenues lined with specialized stalls packed with imported Chinese silks, the aforementioned Arabian horses, and African ivory. But he notes that these markets were not chaotic bazaars. They operated under strict royal regulations.
Right. Transactions were actively weighed, monitored, and taxed by royal market inspectors. It was a highly structured global economic hub.
So we have rivers of wealth flowing through these bazaars, gathered from the 9-card taxes and the global maritime trade. But a state doesn't just hoard gold in a vault. It spends it to project power, enforce legitimacy, and shape society. Where did all that money actually go?
It went into granite, faith, and poetry. The empire viewed itself not just as a military apparatus, but as the active cultural preserver of the South.
The founders and subsequent dynasties established Vijayanagara as a deliberate, heavily funded revival of Hindu traditions that had been severely disrupted by the earlier Sultanate invasions. The state poured immense resources into religious patronage.
They heavily patronized both major branches of Hinduism to ensure broad societal cohesion. They expanded the Virupaksha temple, dedicated to Shiva, who was the patron deity of the ruling dynasties. Simultaneously, they funded the massive Vithala temple complex, dedicated to Vishnu.
But we have to be careful here. When we say they funded temples, a modern listener might think of a church or a mosque today, primarily a spiritual center for weekly worship. That is not what these structures were.
Not at all. In the context of the Vijayanagara Empire, a major temple was a massive socio-economic engine. When the king, a wealthy merchant guild, or a powerful Nayaka endowed a temple, they didn't just give it a chest of gold. They legally transferred the permanent tax rights of entire surrounding villages to the temple administration.
So the temples became major landowners and economic administrators in their own right.
They were massive corporate entities. The temples used their vast revenue to manage local irrigation projects, essentially acting as the agricultural development arm of the state. They employed hundreds of artisans, stonemasons, priests, musicians, dancers, and accountants.
They were huge employers.
Yes. Crucially, they functioned as financial institutions, issuing loans to local merchants and farmers. They were self-sustaining hubs of economic and social activity that anchored the surrounding communities and bound them to the ideological framework of the state.
And this wealth and stability rested on a very complex, stratified social fabric. The society was officially structured around the traditional Varna system, dividing people into broad occupational categories. Brahmins, primarily in administration and religion, Kshatriyas as warriors and rulers, Vaishyas in trade and agriculture, and Shudras in labor and crafts.
While the Varna system provided a rigid theoretical framework, the reality on the ground was far more fluid. The continuous state of warfare and the vast administrative needs of the expanding Nyankara system offered significant avenues for upward social mobility.
So merit played a role.
Absolutely. Exceptional military prowess, engineering skill, or administrative competence could elevate individuals from lower Varnas into positions of significant wealth and authority as military commanders or regional administrators. The state needed competence more than it needed strict adherence to caste purity.
And what about the role of women? Often in medieval historical narratives, women are entirely relegated to the margins or domestic spheres, but the sources here highlight very specific, documented, and highly active roles within the state apparatus.
The accounts from the Portuguese travelers, particularly Fernão Nunes and Domingo Paes, are highly illuminating regarding the royal establishment. They detail separate royal enclosures for women that functioned essentially as highly structured miniature cities.
Wow. Yeah.
Elite women were not merely secluded, they held prominent administrative, economic, and even physical roles within the court.
Yes, the sources mention women functioning as official accountants, keeping track of state expenses, acting as scribes, drafting legal documents, and even serving as armed guards protecting the inner royal enclosures. And my personal favorite detail from the travelogues: women serving as trained wrestlers for royal entertainment.
The presence of female guards and wrestlers indicates a society where elite women, at least within the specific confines of the royal establishment, possessed agency, financial independence, and specialized physical training far beyond traditional domestic duties. Furthermore, we see the extensive institutionalization of the Devadasi system.
Unpack the Devadasi system, because that is a term that carries a lot of complex historical baggage.
The Devadasis were women officially dedicated to the service of the temple deities. During the Vijayanagara period, they were highly educated in classical arts, literature, and complex theological music and dance.
They were highly trained professionals.
They were. Because they were attached to the wealthy temple institutions, they often accumulated significant personal wealth, owned property, paid taxes, and held a highly visible and respected status in the public and cultural spheres, distinct from the domestic roles of married women.
Speaking of arts and literature, this period is broadly considered a renaissance, particularly for the Telugu language. The wealth of the state directly funded a massive literary output. Krishnadevaraya's court was famous for a group known as the Ashtadiggajs.
The Ashtadiggajs translates to the 8 elephants of the directions. They were the 8 preeminent scholars and poets of his court, viewed as the 8 pillars supporting the literary world of the empire.
Like a literary brain trust.
Exactly. The most famous among them, Alasani Padana, authored foundational works of Telugu poetry that are still studied today. But what is truly remarkable is that Krishnadevaraya himself was an accomplished, highly respected poet. He authored the Amukta,
which is a massive Telugu epic poem detailing the life, devotion, and eventual divine marriage of the female Saint Andal. The fact that an emperor, whose primary responsibilities involve managing brutal year-long sieges, negotiating global trade monopolies with the Portuguese, and suppressing rebellions, took the time and possessed the skill to compose a major piece of devotional epic poetry, is striking.
It shows a deep commitment to cultural production. And it's important to note that the court was not exclusively speaking Telugu, it was a highly multilingual ecosystem.
Reflecting the geography they control.
Right. The state actively supported literature in Telugu, Kannada, Sanskrit, and Tamil, reflecting the vast geographic and linguistic diversity of the territories they controlled. They were synthesizing the cultures of the entire southern peninsula.
And this synthesis is most physically visible in their architecture. The wealth of the horse trade and the agricultural surplus was literally carved into the landscape. The Vijayanagara architectural style evolved from older, established Dravidian traditions, but it adapted to the specific, brutal material of the local region, granite.
Granite is an exceptionally hard, unforgiving stone. It is incredibly difficult to carve compared to the softer sandstone or soapstone used by earlier dynasties like the Hoysalas.
Because granite is so hard, it doesn't easily allow for the micro-detailing, the tiny, intricate filigree work seen in earlier temples.
Exactly. The material dictated the form. While they lost some micro-detail, the sheer compressive strength of granite permitted them to build massive, towering, monolithic structures that previous generations could not achieve. They built enormous gopurams.
Explain the physical experience of a gopuram.
A gopuram is a monumental, highly ornate entrance tower to a temple complex. In the Vijayanagara era, these grew to staggering heights, often towering over 150 feet.
That's massive for that era.
It is. If you are a traveler approaching the capital or a major provincial city, you would see these massive, brightly painted stone pyramids dominating the skyline from miles away. They acted as religious beacons, physical border markers of state power, and highly visible symbols of the wealth concentrated in the temple institutions.
Inside the complexes, the architecture is equally imposing. The Vithala temple features the famous monolithic stone chariot, a shrine carved entirely out of massive blocks of granite to look like a wooden processional chariot, complete with stone wheels that originally turned.
They also carved acoustic pillars that actually produce specific musical notes when struck, an incredible feat of resonant engineering.
But the state didn't only build religious structures. They built massive secular complexes to manage the empire. The Mahanavami Dibba is a prime example.
Yes. It is a massive, multi-tiered stone platform, extensively carved with reliefs of hunting, warfare, and foreign envoys. From this elevated platform, the king would observe the 9-day Mahanavami festival, formally reviewing his vast troops, receiving tribute from the Nayakas, and demonstrating the centralized power of the state.
And perhaps the most interesting secular structure, the elephant stables.
The royal elephant stables are a perfect example of architectural and cultural synthesis. It's a massive, elongated building designed to house the elite royal elephants. But architecturally, it features large, sweeping domes and arched doorways that clearly incorporate distinct Indo-Islamic design elements.
So even while positioning themselves as the great defenders of Hindu traditions, their builders were entirely pragmatic, readily adapting useful architectural forms and engineering techniques from their Islamic neighbors to the north.
Exactly. It was a confident, syncretic culture that borrowed what worked, whether that was Muslim cavalry tactics or Islamic arch design, and integrated it into their own structural identity.
So if we pull back, we have an empire with impenetrable granite walls, a booming, highly monetized economy, trading diamonds for war horses, massive armies funded efficiently by the nine-kara system, and a flourishing, multilingual cultural renaissance. It seems invincible. How does an empire this powerful, this deeply structured, fall apart?
The decline is incredibly sharp, and the mechanics of the collapse begin with a dangerous shift in power dynamics during the fourth and final dynasty, the Erevaду dynasty. By the mid-16th century, the nominal emperor sitting on the throne is Sadasivaraya, but he's a figurehead.
Doesn't hold the real power.
No. The de facto ruler, the man controlling the military and the treasury, is his regent, a brilliant, highly ambitious, and ultimately reckless man named Aliya Ramaraya.
Ramaraya decides to pursue a highly aggressive, deeply complex diplomatic strategy regarding the northern sultanates. The old Bahmani Sultanate had fractured into 5 separate, frequently warring Deccan sultanates: Bidchor, Golconda, Ahmadnagar, Bidar, and Berar. Ramaraya decides he's going to play them against one another.
His goal was to maintain regional equilibrium and assert Vijayanagara as the undisputed supreme power broker. If Bijapur attacked Ahmadnagar, Ramaraya would march his massive armies north and ally with Ahmadnagar to push Bijapur back, extracting heavy financial concessions and territorial gains for his trouble.
Just constantly tipping the scales.
Yes. The very next year, he might flip his alliance, siding with Bijapur against Golconda to extract more wealth. He was constantly shifting his support to ensure none of the sultanates could unify or become powerful enough to challenge him directly.
It's like running a geopolitical Ponzi scheme using your neighbor's armies.
Yeah.
As long as you keep moving the debts and the alliances around quickly enough, you look incredibly rich and powerful. You control the board. But the absolute fatal flaw in a scheme like that is that eventually the people you are manipulating are going to sit down, compare notes, and realize they are all being bled dry by the exact same person.
That is precisely the mechanism of his downfall. The sultans, tired of being continuously manipulated, financially drained, and publicly humiliated by Ramaraya's interventions, made a massive strategic decision. They set aside decades of bitter, bloody rivalry.
Which is saying something, given their history.
It was unprecedented. Through a series of rapid diplomatic marriages and treaties, they formed a grand, unified coalition. They combined their militaries into a single, massive force with one singular shared objective: the total destruction of the Vijayanagara state.
This brings us to January 23, 1565. The Battle of Talikota, also referred to in some sources as the Battle of Rakshasi Tangadi. The coalition armies march south, and Ramaraya marches north to meet them. The scale of the armies clashing on the plains is staggering. We're talking hundreds of thousands of men, massed artillery batteries, war elephants, and heavy cavalry.
Despite being in his 80s, Ramaraya commanded his forces directly from a litter. And critically, the early stages of the battle actually favored Vijayanagara. Their sheer numbers and entrenched infantry lines were holding firm against the initial coalition assaults.
They were holding the line.
They were. But the battle didn't pivot on grand strategy. It pivoted on a specific, devastating betrayal from within the Vijayanagara ranks.
The Jilani brothers.
Yes. The Jilani brothers were two prominent Muslim commanders deeply integrated into the Vijayanagara military. Recall Devaraya II's strategy of hiring foreign expertise.
Right, bringing in the specialized cavalry and artillery.
The Jilani brothers were the culmination of that. They were specifically in charge of crucial, highly destructive artillery units and large contingents of cavalry. In the absolute heat of the battle, at the critical moment, they defected.
Wait, if they were fighting a coalition of Islamic sultanates, how did Vijayanagara trust them to hold the most vital part of the line?
In medieval Deccan warfare, mercenary loyalty was generally tied to coin and land grants, not necessarily shared religion. The Jilani brothers had served Vijayanagara because Vijayanagara paid the best.
Okay, that makes sense.
But faced with a massive, unified Islamic coalition that was aggressively framing the conflict as a holy war and likely offered massive bribes and promises of territory by the sultanates, their calculus shifted. They turned their cannons and their cavalry directly onto their own Vijayanagara lines.
The betrayal causes instantaneous utter chaos. The center of the Vijayanagara line collapses under friendly fire. In the ensuing panic, Ramaraya's litter is abandoned by his fleeing guards. He's captured by the forces of the Ahmadnagara Sultanate. He's brought before the Sultan and immediately summarily executed on the battlefield. His head is hoisted on a spear.
The psychological impact of seeing their seemingly invincible octogenarian leader executed breaks the Vijayanagara army completely. They rout, fleeing the field in total disarray. The defeat at Talikota was absolute. The military apparatus was shattered in a single afternoon.
But the battle was just the mechanism of defeat. The true tragedy was what followed. The coalition armies didn't stop at the battlefield. They advanced rapidly on the completely unprotected, heavily wealthy capital of Hampi. What followed was one of the most systematic, devastating, destructive events in Indian history.
The sack of Hampi didn't last for a few days. It lasted for months.
Months of continuous looting.
The sources describe a systematic dismantling of a metropolis. Fires burned continuously for weeks. Palaces, administrative buildings, and symbols of royal authority were methodically torn apart to extract the iron clamps holding the granite blocks together. Statues were smashed.
And the people.
The civilian population, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, fled into the arid countryside. A highly regulated global economic hub was reduced to a blackened ruin.
The immediate aftermath is a total political decapitation. Ramaraya's brother, Tirumala, managed to escape the capital just before the coalition arrived, fleeing with the nominal emperor, Sadashivaraya, and whatever portions of the royal treasury they could load onto elephants. They fled deep into the south, the fortress of Pinakonda. But the core of the empire, the economic and administrative heart, was gone.
And this is exactly where the foundational flaw of the Nayankar system we discussed earlier finally ruptures the state. The long decline.
The system backfires.
Entirely. Remember, the Nayakas were semi-autonomous military governors. When the central authority at Hampi was strong, when the king could enforce transfers and demand troops, the Nayakas obeyed and remitted their taxes. But after Talikota, the dynamic inverted.
The power dynamic flipped.
Completely. The capital is a smoking ruin, the military is destroyed, and the royal family is hiding in a southern fortress with no leverage. Those heavily armed, incredibly wealthy Nayakas looked at the broken central authority and simply saw no reason to continue sending their local wealth to a powerless king.
The exact decentralized structure that allowed them to raise a million-man army is the exact structure that allowed the empire to cleanly shatter into dozens of pieces. Powerful Nayakas in wealthy southern regions like Madurai, Thanjavur, and Ikkari simply stopped answering the king's correspondence. They stopped remitting the taxes, they fortified their own borders, and declared themselves independent, sovereign rulers.
The Aravidu dynasty, lacking the military strength to force the Nayakas back into line, retreated further and further south over the decades. They eventually moved to Chandragiri, operating merely as a shadow of their former glory, a localized kingdom rather than an empire. until they finally faded into historical obscurity around 1646.
But the physical fall of the empire didn't mean the erasure of its culture. Let's explore that legacy. Modern archaeological surveys, like the extensive Vijayanagara research project, show us something fascinating about the mechanics of the destruction at Hampi.
The archaeological evidence heavily indicates that the destruction by the Sultanate armies was highly targeted, not entirely indiscriminate. The coalition forces focused their destructive efforts specifically on dismantling the royal centers, the military infrastructure, the administrative buildings, and the physical symbols of state power.
They were systematically breaking the state.
They wanted to ensure the political entity could never reconstruct itself. However, religious and civilian life in the peripheries and the surrounding agricultural zones slowly adapted and survived. Many of the massive temple complexes survived the initial sack.
And the successor states, those independent Nayaka kingdoms like Madurai and Thanchavara, they preserved the empire's DNA, didn't they? They didn't start from scratch.
Very much so. They viewed themselves as the cultural heirs to Vijayanagara. The Nayakas of Madurai and Thanjavur preserved and continued the exact administrative practices, the legal frameworks, and the taxation systems of the fallen empire.
So the system lived on, just in fragments.
Right. They continued to heavily patronize the arts, heavily supporting the specific musical and linguistic traditions that would eventually codify into modern Carnatic music. They continued to employ the stonemasons to build massive, sprawling Dravidian temple complexes with even taller, more elaborate gopurams.
So the architectural evolution didn't stop.
Not at all. The centralized political entity of Vijayanagara fell in 1565, but its cultural, administrative, and architectural legacy dominated the entirety of southern India well into the 18th century.
So we circle back to where we started in the mud. The floodwaters of Talakota washed away the political center of the empire. But the roots they had put down over 300 years, the hydraulic infrastructure, the cultural synthesis, the deep administrative systems, were simply too deep, too thoroughly integrated into the landscape to be entirely scoured away.
They built for permanence.
They did. The stark, sprawling ruins of Hampi today are a massive physical reminder of how a society utilizes massive engineering, moving mountains of granite and redirecting rivers to enforce a sense of permanence against the chaos of history.
It really forces a perspective shift when you think about it.
It does. If you look at our modern world, what administrative frameworks or physical infrastructures are we building today that might completely outlast the political centers that authorize them? Will it be our sprawling data centers, the subterranean cables connecting our continents, our highway systems? It is something to seriously consider the next time you look at a major public work. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.